Our club has always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas. Here, we offer access to dynamic political, business, and public personalities.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Hello. Everyone's having so much fun catching up. They don't want to hear me, but you definitely want to hear Catherine. So, hi. Just in case from before lunch to now you've forgotten who I was, I am Melanie Griffith, Director of the Canadian Club Toronto, and your hostess. So our club has been celebrating its 125th anniversary year in ways that we could have never imagined. Physically distanced gatherings and warmly welcoming those who join us online. And we've come a long way for sure. One thing that has not changed is the desire for information from respected and accomplished thought leaders. Today's special guest is no exception. For those joining us virtually, please engage with us on social media. Hashtags are on your tables or on your screens. What questions might you have for the President and CEO of CBC Radio Canada? You can interview her through your questions, very old school, because there is pen and paper on your table. Yes, pen and paper. Let me reintroduce you to those things. Please use those Q&A cards found on your table so that we can collect them with a human being and actually have your questions addressed. For those of you joining remotely, please hit the Submit a Question button on the right side of your screen, and we will get your questions up to Saroja. We're also thrilled to host some future journalists from the Toronto Metropolitan University's School of Journalism. Hi, guys. Supported by the Canadian Club of Toronto. We are so pleased to have you all here. We're going to expect a lot of questions from your table, so no pressure. At this time, I would like to introduce our guest speaker. She will make brief remarks, and then we'll be joined in the conversation with Saroja. Here's my introduction. Catherine Tait was appointed to a 5-year term as President and CEO of CBC Radio Canada in April of 2018. She's also chair of the Global Task Force for Public Media, a 2-year-old initiative of the Public Media Alliance. Before her current role, she co-founded New York-based Duopoly Inc., an independent film, television, and digital content company. She also co-founded Thenetic, a digital content company, and Hollywood Suite, which is where I met her, a broadcasting company. She's been a member of a number of industry-specific boards, including E1 Entertainment, Chum Limited, Alliant Inc., Rogers Mobile Film Fund, and the Canadian Film and Television Production Association. In 2019, Catherine was named Playback's Executive of the Year. Last year, Women in Communications and Technology named her Woman of the Year. Congratulations. Joining Catherine in conversation this afternoon is Saroja Coelho. She is an award-winning broadcaster who currently hosts mornings on CBC Music. She began her career as an Asian correspondent in South Korea, where she produced documentaries and reported for CBC, BBC, NPR, and Deutsche Welle. I hope I said that right. That's that, Deutsche Welle. She returned to Canada in 2016 and relocated to Toronto 2 years later, where she guest hosts Q, As It Happens, Here and Now, Ontario Mornings, and Day 6. Let's begin with you, Catherine. The Canadian Club Toronto podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Melanie Griffith, not the actor. Good afternoon. It's really such a pleasure to see you all here in person, really a treat. So distinguished guests here in Toronto in this room, but also online, CBC Radio-Canada board member Rita Shelton-Deverell, first time I'm seeing her in the flesh, CBC and Radio-Canada colleagues. As this event is being live streamed beyond Toronto, I'd like to add to Melanie's land acknowledgement and acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis from coast to coast to coast. I'm honored to be here on World Press Freedom Day on behalf of incredibly brave and dedicated professionals at CBC Radio-Canada and at news organizations across Canada and around the world. Without a strong and free press, democracies cannot function. Every day, journalists work to ensure that we have information, true, accurate information about our governments and about what's happening around us. And for that, they are increasingly under attack. Last year alone, 293 journalists were imprisoned for doing their jobs, a grim global record. Worse, at least 24 were killed. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 months ago, at least 7 journalists covering the war have been killed. And Russia's repression of journalists and its legislation to control media coverage of the war in Ukraine received condemnation around the world. You may have heard of the journalist who held a poster up in the studio of Russia's state television to warn Russians they are not being told the truth about the war in Ukraine. For this, Marina Ovsyannikova was detained, fined, and fears further reprisal. But you may not have heard of Yasmin Gandam, who was spat upon and told to get out of the country while covering a protest against pandemic restrictions. She was working for Global Television here in Canada. We no longer have the luxury of believing that attacks on journalists don't happen in a country like ours. I'm concerned by 3 trends in particular. How social media is being used to abuse and intimidate journalists, how state actors and extremists are weaponizing these platforms to silence journalists, and how some are deliberately subverting facts and truth for personal and even political gain. As we've all seen, social media platforms accelerate and amplify abuse, and those platforms have been reluctant to fix the problem. Unless you've been the target, it's really hard to imagine just how bad this abuse can be. In explaining her decision to leave Twitter, the writer and activist Lindy West called the platform a place where, as she bluntly put it, I am micromanaged in real time by strangers. Neo-Nazis mine my personal life for vulnerabilities to exploit. And men enjoy unfettered direct access to my brain so they can inform me for the 1,000th time that they would gladly rape me if I weren't so fat. These platforms thrive and profit on anger. They're used to mobilize campaigns of intimidation, to silence journalists, and to obscure the truth. Not surprising, then, that state actors leverage these same platforms to feed conflict and undermine our democracies. We now know that for the last decade, Iranian and Russian governments have used tens of thousands of tweets to stoke division in Canadian politics. One researcher has called it digital warfare. Here at home, some will attack what they call the mainstream media. Their rallies will target members of the media with chants, including lately, defund the CBC, And others shout, the media is the virus. And for some, it's a business model. Websites deliberately promote false or inaccurate stories to stoke public anger because it can generate donations and ad revenue. What's being attacked through all these actions is trust. Trust in facts, trust in public institutions, trust in democracy. In other countries where we've seen where all this leads, to journalists being considered the enemy, and truth being whatever those with the largest megaphones say it is. These are steps down a dark path, a path away from democracy. What worries me when people promise to defund the CBC and yet maintain our sister network, Radio-Canada, is the weakening of one of our most important institutions to build and support social cohesion in this country. Je vais être très claire sur ce point. Je ne crois pas une seconde à ceux qui prétendent vouloir protéger Radio-Canada en promettant de définancer CBC. Les Canadiens ont créé ensemble un diffuseur public national indépendant auquel ils font confiance. Nous réalisons notre mission de service public en français, en anglais, ainsi qu'en langue autochtone, d'un bout à l'autre du pays. Et si nous y parvenons, c'est parce que nous mettons nos ressources en commun dans l'intérêt de tous les Canadiens. Quick translation, Canadians have built a national, trusted, independent public broadcaster that serves them in English and in French and in Indigenous languages, no matter where they live. Our services share buildings, people, and resources to give Canadians great TV, radio, and digital content, all for just $34 each year. $34 is 2 months of Netflix premium. That's incredible value. Are we perfect? No. But Canadians know our journalism is built on professionalism and integrity. Our journalistic standards and practices are the gold standard, and they're public. We have 2 independent ombudsmen to investigate complaints. One of them, Jack Nagler, is with us here today. And their findings are public. When we make a mistake, we correct it. We tell you what happened and how we will improve. We're also taking action on the issue of online harm, which seeks to silence and discredit journalists, to bully them, to intimidate them, and directly undermines press freedom. We're working with other media organizations to better protect our journalists from harm and to stand together in saying that these attacks are not okay. Last November, hundreds of media professionals attended the Not OK Forum in Canada to discuss solutions to this problem. Today, I'm proud to say we are releasing a guide of best practices to help newsrooms support their teams, and I want to acknowledge Hannah Storm, who has helped us do in that work. This has been an industry-wide effort, and we've worked with the Toronto Star, CTV News, Global News, La Presse, APTN, and the Canadian Association of Journalists, among many others. We're also pushing social media platforms to enforce their own guidelines and take quicker action to remove toxic messages. And we're asking the federal government to join efforts underway in other countries to support journalism and address this problem through legislation. In Canada, on World Press Freedom Day, there are still many reasons to be optimistic. Our country is more resistant to disinformation than some. We know that countries with strong public media can blunt the edge of fake news. We also know that the majority of Canadians still trust their media. 79% consider our national public broadcaster a trusted source of information. But we cannot ignore what is happening in the digital world and its real-world consequences. Our journalists will continue the hard work they do each and every day because the antidote to fake news is trusted news, and lots of it. That's how we strengthen our democracy, so thank you. I'd like to now bring up Saroja Coelho to join me. I think we've heard the fulsome bio, but I would just add that currently Saroja is interim host of Day 6. no longer with music. I go over there?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll leave all that there.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for letting me be part of this conversation with you. Hello, everyone. This is the most crowded room I have been in 2 years. It's very hard to know whether to keep distance. I half want to hug half the people in the room. It's been so long. It is such an important topic that you're addressing. Everybody can hear the passion with which you come to this. And I'm wondering why, for you personally, online harm, the abuse of journalists, why is that resonating with you as the thing you are committing this kind of time and resource to?
Well, some months ago, I read a report that was issued by UNESCO on this subject, and they very specifically pointed out that women and racialized journalists are disproportionately victims of online harm. And we had been through, Barb and all the people in the company, Susan and Kathy Perry, everybody, we'd all been working on diversity, equity, diversity, and inclusion in a really very deep and compelling way. And so it was literally like 1 and 1 equals more than 2. Like, we needed to include this issue of online harm, because what UNESCO pointed out, Saroja, very, very worrisome, is that these people are leaving the profession. The volume of hate is it's so toxic, and it's so out of control. The magnitude is out of control, that people are choosing, and more likely women and racialized journalists are choosing to leave the vocation of journalism. And that goes against the very fundamental goal that we've been trying to achieve, which is to improve the diversity, to increase the number of voices and people at the table.
That retention part is extremely interesting, because you're right, it's at the exact moment that all of these changes have been made. I understand that you've put together this resource, this guide that you're releasing for journalists, that's actually work from many different voices together. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I heard that only 250 words of the original document survived into this is what happens when you invite journalists to help you write a document. The idea, when I started the conversation with the people in the company, the first point was, if you're attacked online, and I have also had the experience, if someone calls you a piece of garbage, you might think, ooh, that wasn't nice. But if you have a barrage of that kind of a personal attack, or even threats, I'm going to rape you, or I'm going to kill your children, whatever it could be, that starts to take a phenomenal toll. And what we learned from Hannah and other specialists in the field is that this trauma is a form of PTSD, that the journalists are walking around with this terrible pain and suffering. And we really weren't doing anything. It's not that we were mindfully or deliberately not doing anything, we just didn't really know what to do. What happens, if I may, what happens when somebody is attacked, we were not able to call the police on their behalf. They are required to call the police. Well, if you've just been suffering a terrible attack, having that burden of calling the police, and then perhaps having a police officer who hasn't been trained in the area of online harm, or who doesn't consider it a crime, that can also add to the trauma. So what we thought was, what can we do internally and with our colleagues across the industry to build a kind of not a to-do list, a handbook that will help people prepare journalists more adequately. And one of the key issues there is that, questions coming in, is that we do, and Joe Hill is here, one of our security people. We do very, very intensive hostile environment training for our journalists that go into war zones, have done for years. And but what we haven't really considered is we do training around, what do you do if you're attacked in a demonstration, for example. But we haven't made that a widespread practice for online harm. So the idea of this handbook is to, on the one hand, prepare our managers, work with our journalists, be better equipped, and that alone is just kind of an internal handbook that we share with all our media colleagues. And then on the other hand, we keep working on the source, and that is the platforms themselves and the legislation that we hope will at least be a stick that we can stop some of this stuff from going on.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to remind everybody you're very welcome to add your own questions. As Melanie said, there's paper and pen on your table. If you're joining us on the live stream, you can also submit questions. We would love to hear what you would like to know and get out of this fireside chat. I want to flip things for a moment because what you've been speaking about is the journalistic experience, which is extremely important and also very frightening. But there's the shared piece with the Canadian public is trust. Mm-hmm. You're talking here about whether or not we can trust that we're safe when we're doing our jobs. Mm-hmm. I'd like to take that a step further and really look at how the Canadian public can trust in the public broadcaster when the public broadcaster is under fire, when there are so many streams of information coming at people, and some of that, as you said, is intended to destabilize democracy, destabilize our faith in our media. What do you see as your role, and what kind of work are you doing to retain that trust, to encourage the Canadian public to feel that they can trust their Canadian broadcaster as all this other information?
That's like the biggest question you could possibly ask. Let me count the ways. I mean, honestly, we live, and I mean, I often say the beating heart of CBC, Radio-Canada, is the journalism. And the nervous system is the entertainment programming. I mean, we are so embedded in the mission and the mandate to inform, enlighten, and entertain. And I do believe that as long as we stay very true to that North Star, you know, Aristotle responded to the student, how will I know the good man? I will know the good man by the good things he does. So I do believe that as long as we are true to the journalistic standards and practices, as long as we reflect upon how we can be better, and that we share that and maintain that transparency, we continue to build the trust. But more practically, we are members of the Trusted News Initiative, which is a very significant group of journalistic organizations from the BBC to Reuters, and we work with them on trying to find ways to address the issue of misinformation. We work on our local connections in communities. And there's nothing more important than that. That is what distinguishes us from a Netflix or an Amazon. We are in the community. And if we work with Canadians on the ground and they benefit and understand more about what's going on around them, then we build trust. And some of the places we do that, for example, we've launched a library project, and we have projects in Prince Rupert, we have projects in Happy Valley, Goose Bay, again, with our CBC journalists working with the community. So that is, to me, a very, very important part of what we do. And again, partnerships with, you know, the Canadian Association of Journalism or the Journalism Foundation, where we're funding or sponsoring fellows in the area of Black and Indigenous journalists. I mean, the list is endless, Saroja. You just opened a huge...
It's interesting what you're saying, because something I've really noticed is some of that outreach piece, that actually being in the community and not only going in, harvesting a story, but actually being and spending time. We have community bureaus. We have these new initiatives to kind of reach out, and it's interesting to think about the role that plays in building that trust, because then you're actual people in the community.
And probably the most relevant to that point has been the work we've been doing to improve what we call the inclusive newsroom, to be better, to be more sensitive, to shine a diversity lens on everything we do. What are the stories we're picking? Who's telling the story? And just being sensitive to all of that component, rather than just, as you say, going in, harvesting the story, and off to the next one.
If we return to the issue of this onslaught, this abuse and harm that you've been speaking about, I want to return to something that you said once. You said public media blunts the edge of fake news, and I was wondering if you could expand on that.
Well, we know, I mean, we've seen it in many, many studies, that in democracies where there is a truly independent public broadcaster, as opposed to a state-owned broadcaster, there is a higher degree of trust in the media. I mean, the surveys show it. And that there is a higher confidence that there's truth-telling going on rather than misinformation. So there is an indication, clearly. I mean, the phenomenon that public broadcasters, it's not just Canada that's suffering from defund the CBC chants. It's happening in England, it's happening in France, it's happening all over the world. The storming of the Australian ABC a couple of years ago, I don't know, the equivalent of the RCMP going in and taking files out of the public broadcasters' offices. These are things we would never have heard of. So one of the things that we're working on is really coordinating and working with those, that's partly what that global task force is about, is trying to work with those other public broadcasters to make sure that we don't become eroded by this rising tide of populism.
Vous avez décrit des initiatives visant à conserver la confiance du public dans nos rapports. Existe-t-il des initiatives spécifiquement conçues pour le public francophone?
Mais on dit toujours Radio-Canada et CBC, c'est deux marchés différents, bien sûr. Et puis on partage beaucoup, en fait, des projets. Puis, mais l'approche est souvent différente. Alors, je pense à un exemple, c'est pour le travail contre la désinformation. On a une équipe à Radio-Canada, les décrypteurs, par exemple. Ouais. Alors, ce programme-là, c'est une équipe qui traque toutes les fausses nouvelles pendant la semaine. Et puis, il y a une émission à la télé sur RDI chaque semaine. Alors, ça, c'est une émission différente, mais l'approche, la mission, le mandat, on a ça en commun. On partage nos valeurs, on partage l'approche, comme j'ai dit, mais la façon dont une équipe travaille, souvent, c'est différent.
Merci pour ça. Something that you talked about just
now. And you're not going to give an English version of that?
I can try. Certainly, the central idea there is that there's a project called the Décrypteur, which is part of Radio-Canada's investigative team, and they really look at fact-checking. It's an excellent project, certainly worth checking out if anybody is interested. It's easy enough to translate the website if you don't speak French. And I think that they're really looking at very unique ways of questioning some of those riptides.
Yeah, and they're part of an international group, the Poynter Institution, I think it's called. Heaton will correct me if I'm wrong. And so it's recognized internationally. I should mention part of what we're doing in our journalism is really getting that recognition. I mean, anybody who works in this room at CBC or Radio-Canada in the news department should be so proud. The recognition, it's just phenomenal. And you too.
I think that there's an interesting idea that you brought up in your original speech just now that I really want to come back to, which is what are the motivations? And one of the ones that you addressed is the profit motive, that it is exceptionally lucrative to start a website, to put misinformation, to tell people that that they can't trust the sources of media that they used to go to. That actually has a click value. Yes. And sometimes it's not even money. Sometimes it's notoriety, which equals a certain amount of power in the world. There are a lot of motivations that are not the same motivations for why somebody might go and work for public media or go and work as a journalist in general. This is a very new territory that we're in. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what your experience has been with that and how you're seeing that unfold in the work that you're doing right now.
Well, I should just say, there has always been fake news. When we were preparing for this, somebody pointed out in 1835, I think it was, in the New York Sun, did a series of articles on life forms on the moon. So the reality is that inclination, maybe it's part of human nature. I don't know. And maybe it's just that thing. If it's wild enough, if it's crazy enough, if it's offensive enough, I'm going to get a bigger audience. And, people are going to be searching for that notoriety, as you say. I don't know how we stop that phenomenon except by creating tools to protect the journalism and possibly, and this is something that we are exploring with some of our public broadcaster colleagues, perhaps creating tools and products in the social media space to create a safe place for discourse, for civil discourse. Is that possible? That's really, it's aspirational, but I really think it's way overdue.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions
Yes, sure.
from the audience. What do you think Canada should do to promote safer press around the world?
Well, our first obligation is to our Canadian press. And it's not to say I don't want to protect the press around the world. Of course I do. But we do have a very urgent issue, and I hope that message came across in my notes today. We have an urgent issue in Canada. Something has changed. People are attacking the CBC logo vehicles. We've never seen that in the history of this organization. So, and at Global and at CTV. So we have to really address what's going on at home and talk about it. And we did this Not Okay Forum, and we invited international journalists and other parties. And of course, we're involved with all sorts of media, news media companies. But I mean, my real focus, and I think the focus of everyone in this room should be what do we do to fix what's going on here?
I'm going to turn to another one. One was about how you keep the CBC app relevant in this conversation.
Which app?
The
Which one?
if you're, I guess this one would probably be framed as the current events, where people are accessing their news, where they're accessing the most recent information about.
I want to know who thinks it's not relevant. Please advise. We're open to any feedback. I mean, honestly, we have Andre Lau here, who is the managing editor of Digital News. Maybe she'd like to answer, how do we keep our app relevant? I mean, we are working constantly on what that interface is, how accessible it is. And by the way, I want to say a word about accessibility, because we talk a lot about diversity, and oftentimes we forget accessibility. I'm so unbelievably proud of the work that we did at the Olympics in Tokyo and Beijing. In under 6 months, we did incredible work making sure that all Canadians would have access to the Olympics and the Paralympics. So I don't know, maybe somebody grabs Andre after this and gets more information on the app.
We have, as you know, some young journalists here. And there are a couple of questions here about tips for emerging journalists in an era where you can't always, where the public doesn't always feel they can trust their sources of information.
Well, be brave and build a network. I always say that to young anything, not just journalists. Build a network of support. It's what we do at CBC and Radio-Canada. I think that, first of all, please apply for a job. We're always looking for people. And it's an amazing environment. And I didn't know journalism before I got this job. I'm from more of the creative producer business side. And it has just been an incredible eye-opener to see the passion of this vocation. This is heroes' work. So be brave, and but build that network of support. Do not be alone. You are not alone, and certainly not in the online harm game. We know you are not alone, and we're here to support you.
I want to, as we come to the end of our time, I just want to bring things full circle, because you did mention leaders of political parties encouraging followers to harass journalists. A lot of that is happening online, but we also saw it in Ottawa with people crowding journalists. I believe it was from Global. A journalist actually turned the camera around and showed people were jeering and screaming shame, and they hadn't even started their reporting. There was just such a level of rage in the streets and also online. But I'm wondering if you could clarify for us why it's so damaging when politicians paint the media as the enemy.
Well, because the purpose of it is nefarious. The journalist becomes the front line. I mean, I was so shocked to see those images and our own people having to have security around them when they were trying to report on an event in the streets of Ottawa. It was very, very disturbing. So the danger is, we say a political party, it could be any party that has one end, in that case maybe gathering support or votes, or it could be making money or whatever. If you're directing your bile at an innocent who is trying to do the work of speaking truth to power, which is what journalists do, challenging power, trying to get to the heart of what is really going on in a situation, well, then it's just as I said, it's like you've really shattered the real the underpinnings of our society, and that's very, very worrisome.
I think we're coming towards got 5 minutes left. I'm going to go to this, to a question, and I hope that I read this correctly because the writing is a little small.
Want my glasses?
Speaking of contributing to online disinformation, we just saw CNN shut down their app. How do you compete in the online world where many are getting their news? I'm not sure I understood that question entirely myself. Yeah, please, you could just say it yourself.
Janella, please.
Sorry for my
No, it's fine.
I guess it was kind of the question about what we were talking about there. The idea that, you're trying to compete in this online world where people are getting a lot of misinformation and disinformation because there is so much appetite for it. And yet we see, someone like CNN who is trying to be in that field, and they've, shut down after not even 3 weeks. So how do you kind of try to find that balance between saying this is where we need to be because this is where people are, but at the same time you're competing with.
Well, I think one of the issues, and if I can dovetail that to Twitter, and why do we not tell our journalists to stop being on Twitter? I mean, that's an obvious question. The reality is Twitter is a tool. It's a tool for information gathering. It's a tool to connect and to amplify a story. So if we tell our journalists, don't be where the news is, then how do they do their jobs? So our job becomes, how do we make Twitter a better, safer place? So the same goes to your point. I think as a public broadcaster, I don't know the motivation behind CNN shutting down their app, but I would say as a public broadcaster, we have to be where the people are. And we have to figure out how to do that in a safe, in a better way than we are now, because clearly our people are suffering under attack.
There is
another one.
This is the last one.
Okay, I could talk to you all day. Happily.
For many people, this increasing polarization, this lost sense of shared facts. We both look at the same thing, and we generally can agree at what we're looking at. The loss of that shared sense that something is true or that somebody tells us something, we can believe it, is exceptionally discouraging for people. I mean, it has an actual emotional impact. It has the political impact that you've already addressed. But I'm wondering, in the midst of all of this, and in the midst of the work that you're doing, speaking to RCMP, speaking to public security, do you see signs of hope?
Well, I would just say, now I'm going to quote another philosopher, so you'll understand where I come to these subjects, is Heidegger talked about the spiral of truth, that there is no single truth. So we as journalists, I shouldn't say we, I'm not a journalist, but our team, they're always grappling with it. It's a big ideological issue. What is the truth? The truth for you, the truth for me, the truth for an Indigenous journalist, the truth for a Black journalist. So I just right out of the gate, I say, let's not get too certain about the truth, but let's be rigorous. And I think we are with our journalistic standards and practices. Let's challenge each other. Let's keep our newsrooms dynamic. And I have huge hope because I've seen, even in the 2 years of this pandemic, enormous change at CBC Radio-Canada, enormous change in the ranks of who works there, enormous change in attitude. I'm enormous. I think Madeleine Albright is another great hero of mine, and she said, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I share that position.
That is a wonderful note for us to close the conversation on. Catherine, thank you so much. Everybody, Catherine Tait.
Thank you, Saroja. That was fun.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine, on behalf of Canadian Club Toronto, thank you for your impassioned defense of journalism and for your leadership of Canada's national broadcaster. For generations, Canadians have counted on CBC Radio-Canada to be our storyteller. It has done this admirably, winning multiple journalism and media awards. Working in this current environment, When critics abound, detractors are plenty, and the abuse of power often targets journalists. It's comforting to see CBC, Radio Canada, leading the protection of journalistic freedoms and rights with courage. We wish you continued success in your leadership of our public broadcaster. Saroja, you were fantastic to listen to. Such a pleasure, whether on air or in person, and I love your shoes. Thanks for eloquently facilitating this important conversation. Before we close, let me invite our audiences to join us for our next event, which is Wednesday, May 18th, with the President and CEO of Enbridge, Inc., who will be joined in conversation with the Honorable Brian Tobin. We hope you can join us. Let me conclude by thanking our AV supplier, Van Valkenburg Communications, and LiveMedia.ca for making it possible for us to gather today. Members and guests, again, don't forget to sign up for your membership. And thank you for being with us. Take care and stay safe.